Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Mental Health Matters with me, your host Mariam Pelli, and joining me as always is my co-host and mental health professional, Anisa Diab. Welcome to the show, Sister Anisa.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us as always. Sister Anisa, today our topic is about suicide prevention. So I'll jump straight into it. I understand that suicide prevention has been a big passion for you over the years. Can you just explain what made you get into that field of work?
Yeah, so I think this started in graduate school where when I was doing my training, one of the things that we talked about is, what do you do if you have a client who is wanting to end their life? Or what if, a client has ended your life? How do you process that? How do you deal with it as a counselor? And, a lot of times we think of a person being unwilling to change as being very difficult in the counseling process, right? There are these stages of change, and when somebody is unwilling to take action or do the work, we have a lot of conversations around how that can be very difficult. But one of the biggest nightmares and greatest difficulties and tragedies in the mental health field is when you lose your client to suicide and dealing with that. So I always felt like this was something I wanted to avoid at all costs. I wanted to figure out ways to help prevent that and manage that. But I also felt that, especially as a Muslim, within our community, this is a huge taboo area that we don't have a lot of discussion around. We don't talk a lot about. And to me, I've always been about addressing the issues that seem to get silenced, because where there's silence, there's stigma and there's shame associated with it. And from a spiritual perspective, I feel like this work is very much is very sacred. It really does make me feel closer to my creator, because as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Holy Quran, whoever saves a life, it's as though he saved all of humankind. So when we learn these suicide prevention skills, and anybody can learn them, I think it's important, just like we learn CPR and first aid, to learn the skill set to be able to help someone in that situation. But when we're helping with somebody who's struggling through that, we are essentially helping to save lives. And I think that is the best way to be a hero. I've found that this issue affects the Muslim community much more than we think. It's not unusual for me at this point. I can say, having worked for several years with predominantly Muslim clients, for a Muslim to tell me they have suicidal thoughts on a regular basis, or they've had a previous attempt. And there's a very important research paper that actually just came out from Stanford University here. And it's a groundbreaking study on suicide in the Muslim community, which compared, Muslim suicide attempts compared to other faith groups. And it found that Muslims are actually twice as likely to attempt suicide compared to other faith groups. So I think that on the one hand, that's very sad to get that information, but it's also very important for us to be aware of this. And for anybody who's listening in today, this might be a really triggering topic for you. So please, check in with yourself and see your capacity if you're able to tune into this today. And if not, maybe to listen in on another day, or to do some other self-work in this area, because it can really be a triggering topic for folks.
It's interesting, actually, that you mentioned within the Muslim community, because that's something I didn't actually know. Why do you think that suicide is on the rise?
Yeah, it's on the rise for a lot of different reasons. But one thing we know is that roughly 41% of individuals with mental illness report getting treatment. A lot of people who are suicidal, and we're talking about 90% of people who are suicidal and who want to end their life, they have depression or another mental health disorder, such as bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, and then they usually have some maladaptive coping strategies that they try to use to deal with that, such as substance abuse issues. And then, to know that fact that majority of people who are suicidal are struggling with a diagnosable mental health issue, and that only 41% are actually getting treatment. And these are statistics in the United States from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. But to know that, you begin to see where the problem lies, because we know that 80 to 90% of people who get treatment for depression, they respond effectively with therapy and or medication. So if we can get this other 60%, on board and committing themselves to getting mental health treatment and addressing any kind of stigma that's associated with it, which there's still a lot of stigma around it, then there's a lot of hope for recovery. And suicide is one of the most preventable public health issues there is. The problem is access, and we can get into that a little bit more in the episode as well. But another reason I think too why it seems to be on the rise is people are talking about it more. It used to be before that if somebody died by suicide, they would blame it on something else. They might say this person had a car accident or they died by another means. But people, I think, are a lot more open nowadays about what's happening, what's going on. And as a result, it's getting reported more for what it actually is. Another thing is we see, substance abuse issues on the rise. That can contribute if somebody's in a state of intoxication. That can definitely contribute to somebody taking their own life. Overuse of digital technology, online bullying, all of that can contribute. There's been studies that show that the overuse of technology leads to depression, leads to anxiety, specifically social media. And also, whereas, students might have dealt with bullying just at school, now it's like they have to take that home with them as well and deal with it on the internet. So we know that bullying can be a risk factor. Also, this is specifically a big issue within the United States. It's easier to access firearms and other lethal means, very easy in this country. And as a result, it's very easy to take one's life, unfortunately. So, this is why we need a multifaceted approach to address this issue of suicide. We need all sectors of society involved, not just mental health professionals, but government officials implementing policies related to gun control and lethal means access. We need more mental health professionals to provide services. It's well known that in this country, in the United States, there's a shortage of psychiatrists. So there's a very long wait list to get in. And as a result, that, increases the number of hospitalizations, the number of people using emergency rooms, whereas they could, get help from a provider. We see it also in rural areas where there's issues in low income communities and middle class communities, especially related to finances and all of that. So in our educational sector too, growing up, we didn't talk about mental health in our elementary, middle schools, high schools at all. And now I'm seeing this shift where, in the schools, they're doing more in terms of talking about mindfulness and increasing access to mental health professionals within schools. And even I had the privilege, alhamdulillah, when I was working in a college setting to receive, our counseling center had received grant funding actually to provide a suicide prevention program and mental health promotion program to the student body, to the entire faculty and staff. We hosted awareness events. We did suicide prevention trainings. All of this helped tremendously to change the campus culture, to get students to talk more about mental health. We saw an uptick in the number of students accessing mental health services on our campuses and being able to refer others to the appropriate resources. So there's a multifaceted approach we have to take to address this issue.
Could you tell us about a time when you had to work with somebody with a patient who no longer wanted to live?
There are so many situations like that, unfortunately, and predominantly my experience with that comes from being a crisis counselor for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. At that time, there were so many calls that would come in from people that were just on the verge of ending their life and wanting some kind of hope, some kind of reason to keep going. And unfortunately, with confidentiality, I can't go into a whole lot of specifics around those situations. But all I can say is sometimes, somebody would be, literally in front of the train tracks, about to make a decision, literally on the edge of a bridge. And you try to help de-escalate them. And a lot of that involves listening, a lot of listening to try to understand what's contributing to them wanting to die, and hearing their story and validating their concerns and helping them see some semblance of hope. I would highly recommend to anybody who's interested in this work of suicide prevention to have a look at Kevin Hines' documentary. It's called Suicide: The Ripple Effect. You can find it on YouTube. But this is a man who, he was, in San Francisco on the Golden Gate Bridge. He wanted to end his life that day. He actually, right before he was going to jump off the bridge, there was a woman who asked to take, who had asked him to take her photograph. And he says in the story, he was pausing a lot. She was pausing. She was doing all these poses, and it was really difficult for him to sort of go through. And he was wondering how long he was going to be stuck with this woman. Eventually, he jumps off the bridge. And he said in that moment, I immediately regretted my decision. The moment I jumped, I wish I hadn't done it. He was somebody who struggled with bipolar disorder his whole life. He didn't really see a way out of his problems. When he got to the bottom, on impact, he said something was keeping him afloat. And there was actually this, he didn't realize this until later, but there was a sea lion that had been circling him. And this seal was sort of propelling him off the top of the water, keeping him from sinking. So he actually lived to tell the story and survived. Most people never survive something like that. It's thousands of feet. Pretty much you die on impact in that situation. The thing is, suicide is often, it's this temporary, it's a permanent solution, that is, to a temporary problem. People want to take back control in their life. They feel like the control is gone. And so in order to do that, to get that control back, they want to take their own life by whatever means that is. But in my experience, most people, they want help. Most people are confused about this decision. And a lot of times they think that because they've been struggling for so many years, I've had clients say to me, I've been struggling with this for 7 years. What's going to be different about this year? I'm tired. But I always say to these folks, it only takes one day for things to change. It only takes one person to help change your life. It only takes one moment to help, turn the trajectory of your life around and make things better. And for some people, you just have to help them find what is that reason for living, what's going to help them stay focused. Maybe it's not wanting to be separated from their parent. Maybe it's even a pet, not like just knowing that if I end my life, this pet is not going to have anyone to take care of them. So you have to help them find their reason for living and persuade them to keep going.
What are some of the common misconceptions that you see in the Muslim community when it comes to suicide?
Yeah, I think there's a lot. One is that this doesn't really happen in our community. This tends to happen more in non-Muslim communities or people who are not religious. However, we know, again, based on the research I was mentioning earlier, this is not the case. There's a lot of suicidal ideation. And even if somebody doesn't want to act on it, a lot of times people live with this on a daily basis, especially if they're struggling with a chronic mental illness such as depression, or another mental illness like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, anxiety. This might be in the background of their minds constantly. Another thing that comes up is when somebody does end their life by suicide, there's a misconception that it was for a specific reason. I remember a situation in the Muslim community where this one person had recently broken up with their girlfriend and then ended their life soon after. And everybody kept saying, well, it's because he broke up with his girlfriend and, you know, he wasn't a religious person and all of this. And you just can't make blanket statements like that because you don't know what other aspects or factors that person was experiencing. In my professional experience, it's more than one thing that leads somebody to want to end their life. It's not just coming from a broken home or a bad family or whatever. There's a lot of issues leading up, a lot of triggers, a lot of risk factors, which inshallah we can talk about. What's interesting is even Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq alayhi salam, he has a book, Lantern of the Path, and he talks about the reasons for suicide. And if you'll notice, he mentions a lot of different reasons. He talks about mental illness. He talks about gambling. He talks about drinking. He talks about a lot of different issues. So we have to remember it's a multifaceted problem. There's never just one reason somebody ends their life. And we never truly understand what somebody is going through at the time of their death.
Are there any particular words or phrases that we can use perhaps so we can be a lot more sensitive when we're discussing the topic of suicide? Because I know that sometimes we tend to throw about a lot of words which are incorrect labels or misuse of words, and like people sometimes they don't know that their words are not correct or they shouldn't be using certain phrases. So how can we, talk about this topic in a sensitive way?
For sure. Language definitely matters when you're talking about this. So for instance, you might hear somebody say, did you hear that so-and-so committed suicide? Or did you hear about that actor, the famous guy who committed suicide? And you have to try to veer away from phrases like committed suicide. So, and I'll talk about why. So you might have noticed already in this episode, I've used ended suicide or ended life by suicide. And that's the preferred phrase or terminology over using the word committed suicide. Committed, signifies a couple of things. One, that somebody committed fully with their full mental capacity to ending their life. And what we know from research is a lot of times people are not in touch with reality at the moment that they're ending their life. So they might, again, be in a psychotic moment or intoxicated or something like that. And they're just not in touch with what they're doing. So you can't fully consent or commit to something when you're not in the right headspace. Second, within the United States, I don't know about other places, but within the United States, especially in the 40s and the 50s, it was actually seen as a crime to end your life by suicide, which you could get punished for and sanctioned for. So that's why they used to use the word committed, because it was synonymous with committing a crime. And that can be very stigmatizing for individuals who are having thoughts of suicide, because it makes them feel as though they're going to get in trouble if they reach out for help. People today aren't thrown in jail for attempting suicide. They get help. They get mental health treatment and proper supports. We also don't have institutions anymore where people are put in straitjackets and all of that you used to see in the older movies. That's not how people are treated. So that's one of the reasons we want to use end of life or ended their life instead of committed suicide. The other thing you hear is, did that person successfully complete suicide? Did they have a successful attempt? And we want to avoid using the word successful because there's nothing successful about somebody wanting to end their life, right? This is detrimental to their existence, negatively impacts families and communities. So there's nothing successful. So you can just say, again, that that person did complete a suicide attempt or ended their life. And the other thing is just not defining that person by their disorder. And so if they are, having suicidal thoughts, trying to avoid, it sometimes can be difficult, but trying to avoid using words like that person is, suicidal. And again, trying to say instead they're having suicidal thoughts, they're experiencing suicidal ideation rather than labeling them as being such, because we want to promote hope. We want them to feel there's a way to get out of it, and there is. So when you put those labels on people, whether you say that person is depressed, that person is bipolar, that person is OCD, it makes them feel like that's them, that's who they are. And people are so much more than these labels and their disorders.
And I wanted to ask you, are there any certain factors that increase the risk of attempting suicide?
There are a lot of risk factors. One of them is, prior suicide attempts. Has a person tried to do it in the past? If so, the risk goes up for that person. Is this person misusing drugs, alcohol? Does this person have mental health disorder? Again, particularly depression. Do they have access to lethal means? Do they even know somebody in their family or in their friend group who has recently died by suicide? Does this person seem to be disconnected socially? Do they have any kind of chronic disability, chronic illness that they're experiencing? And lack of access as well has been shown to be a risk factor. So is it very difficult for them to get mental health supports? And the risk factors, they definitely vary across the groups too. So this can be dependent on the culture, the age, even the gender. So for instance, we know and this is again, statistics for the US, that the cultural group with the highest suicide rate in the country is actually Native Americans. And one of this is the fact that we know they've gone through so many moments in history of historical trauma, with resettlement, with destruction of their cultural identity, diseases and all these illnesses and murders that were introduced to their communities. So there's a lot of intergenerational healing and trauma. So that's one of the reasons the risk factor is higher for those individuals. But it's just really, you have to look at each person in each case, situation by situation, to find their own narrative of what their unique risk factors are, and really pay attention to that. And also to listen out for the protective factors. What are their reasons for continuing? So maybe they have good supports of friends. They have a therapist they're really connected with. They, you have to really try to listen in to those connections and get them to focus in on that as their safety plan, and how to access those supports to help them stay motivated to continue living.
What are some of the warning signs in someone who's contemplating suicide?
There are a lot of warning signs that people will usually give. Most of the time, there's these invitations, these signs that people want help. They'll either threaten it in some way, like, I don't even know why I'm here anymore. I wish I would just die. Like, they'll say it openly. And sometimes you have to look between the lines and you have to see, what somebody really means. Like, somebody might say, like, I don't even know why I bother trying anymore. I'm never going to graduate. I'm never going to find a way out of this problem. And then you have to, to see what that means from that person. And then substance abuse issues are another warning sign that, is a problem. Anytime you hear somebody feeling like they don't have a purpose anymore. They've lost that sense of meaning, lost a sense of control. They're anxious about a lot of different things in their life. They just can't seem to get out of that anxiety mode. They feel trapped, like there's no way out of their situation. There's a lot of campaigns that we see here, like the It Gets Better movement. And for these individuals, they feel like things are never going to get better. There's a lot of hopelessness. There's this feeling of no hope ever, being able to continue on and have a successful future. So that lack of hope is one of the biggest indicators. There is withdrawal as well. A person just withdrawing from their community, from their friend group. Anger, reckless behavior could be another sign. An instance of that could be somebody's driving and, they're just speeding. They don't seem to care about their life or other people around them. Mood changes is another one. Dramatic mood change especially. And it doesn't have to be just from like a negative emotion to a positive emotion, or it doesn't have to be like, somebody's content and everything's okay to them then feeling depressed or sad or all these difficult emotions. It could even be that person, has this positivity, has this contentment all of a sudden after a long period of talking about wanting to end their life. Sometimes that's a sign that that person has made their peace with the decision and they may want to end their life. So you have to look out for any kind of significant mood change.
If you see any of these warning signs, is it okay to approach that person and ask them directly about suicide?
Yeah, so a lot of people worry that if they ask the question about suicide, that they're putting this idea into their heads. And this is just not the case. A lot of people, young people especially, they know about suicide. They're very aware from friends in school, from YouTube, all of that. So you're not, teaching them something new. You really do have to ask directly if you feel like this is something that they're considering, they're contemplating. Most of the time, in my experience, when you ask them directly, there's a sense of relief. They feel heard, they feel understood, they feel like, wow, this person gets me. It's a relief to be able to talk about it openly with somebody who's willing to discuss it. So you definitely want to ask directly if you feel like somebody's kind of beating around the bush and, talking about feeling hopeless or why they even bother to do things. Like you definitely want to try to read between the lines and say, hey, are you talking about suicide here? Is that something you're thinking of? What do you mean when you're saying this?
If you do suspect that someone close to you or someone you know might be wanting to end their life, what is it that you can possibly do to help them? Can you help them?
For sure. I mean, I think all of us can, engage in bystander intervention and should, try to be gatekeepers, try to stand up to the plate and help somebody. So you don't have to be a therapist to do that, although you ideally want to connect that person to the right supports, but you first want to focus on your safety. First ask yourself, am I in danger by helping this individual? Do they have weapons nearby or a means close by? And if so, that's not a time to like knock on their door and go to their house and have a conversation. You definitely want to get yourself to safety. So in that situation, you just call 911 or whatever in your country the emergency number is, to emergency dispatch right away so that they can get the proper supports. The second thing, after you have made sure that it's safe, is if you can be the one to connect with them, but you do that. Say to the person, I noticed like you don't seem yourself, or I noticed you just mentioned, you're thinking about suicide. Can you help me understand your reasons for wanting to end your life? Why are you considering this? What's contributing to that? A big chunk of suicide prevention is listening. It's really, really trying to understand what that person is experiencing. You want to validate their concerns, and say like, oh my God, it's just, this is so much going on. I didn't know that you just lost your dad last week. I had no idea that you're also dealing with financial issues and, relationship issues. And this is all triggering memories of, trauma from childhood. And this must be a lot right now. It's so hard. I can't imagine what you're dealing with. Being there for them and trying to reflect back what they must be feeling. That's where understanding happens and connection, when a person feels like somebody else on the other end gets where they're going through. When you invest that big chunk of time in helping them feel understood, that's when you want to take the opportunity to create some confusion for them. Obviously, in like normal life, it's not normal to try to confuse people. But in this situation, you do want to create confusion. And I think they're already confused. So you're really just underscoring what they're confused about in terms of making this decision. So you want to do that by asking what their reasons are for living, and saying, obviously, the fact that you're here, or the fact that you called me, the fact that you haven't done this already tells me that you're not really sure about wanting to do this. What are your reasons for living? And then, saying something along the lines of, wow, it sounds like you have a lot of things to live for, or that are important things that bring you some meaning. And to me, it sounds like you don't want to just, you don't want to check out of life. You just want to check out of the pain that you're dealing with. When you help somebody put that into perspective, I think it really helps them regain a sense of control. That they're, a lot of times people say, you're right. It's not the life I want to get out of. It's the pain. It's the pain cycle. And if you say to them, if I were to help you, identify some supports to help you get out of this cycle, would you be open to that? Would you be open to listening, open to getting some help? And that's where you ask them questions like, do you have a family member you can rely on that's supportive, a trusted friend to reach out to? Have you been to counseling in the past? Or are you connected with a mental health provider? So this is when, you help them with referral resources. So for example, in the United States, we have like a phone number for referral and information called 211. And you have to explore in other countries what that resource might be. Your local health department has a database. Usually in every country, a local health department will have a list of providers, or will offer those supports within the department itself. Crisis hotlines can also be a great way to start. So National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, or another crisis support hotline, can be a great way to begin to explore those supports. But the main thing is you don't want to let them walk away from you still intent on ending their life. If they come to you, they talk to you and say, I'm willing to, commit to my safety, and I'm willing to reach out to these supports, that's when, you can breathe a sigh of relief and check in on them every once in a while. But otherwise, if they're not willing to safety plan with you, if they're not willing to get the supports that are needed, that's when, you really have to take action. And, if it's a coworker, you contact your supervisor, you let them know what's going on. If it's a friend at school, you contact the principal, you contact somebody who's an administrator who can help that person so they can get in touch with their parents. This is not something you ever want to keep secret. And a lot of times people are suicidal. They want to keep it secret, even up until the point of wanting to act on it. And it can feel like you're betraying the person if you do let somebody else know. But it's really important that you prioritize that person's life over how they're feeling in the moment and whether or not they're going to be angry with you. So again, if they're not willing to get help, that's when you really need to act. You need to call the appropriate supports. And a crisis hotline can also walk you through what to do next if you're unsure.
And is there any help or support for family members or friends of those who've taken their own life by suicide?
Yeah, there's so many resources available, and I feel like, those are the people that need the most help, is what we call those survivors of suicide, because there's often a lot of shame, a lot of guilt, a lot of regret. Maybe if I had reached out sooner, if I had picked up on these signs, maybe something could have been done to prevent it. But a lot of times, sometimes they do give warning signs, but sometimes it's very difficult to tell. And there might be very little signs a person puts out. So it's important for that individual, that family, to get the proper support. There's a lot of survivors of suicide support groups. If you look at the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, they have information about that. Out of darkness walks, to walk in honor of somebody who ended their life by suicide, and then to raise money for these organizations to help do suicide prevention work in the community. But it's really critical to help process that grief and that loss. I worked with a committee where the mother, who she had lost her son to suicide, created an organization to try to address suicide and mental health issues within the community. And she would raise money, scholarship funds for students. So there's a lot of ways to channel that grief into what you can do to help prevent another family from experiencing something similar.
What are some things that parents should do or be aware of when it comes to suicide prevention?
Yeah, I think you have to really pay attention to changes in behavior. Don't just assume because your kid comes home and takes long naps every day after school that this is just typical normal teenage behavior, when that can really be a sign of checking out, a sign of depression. Sometimes we assume everything is good with our kids just because they have good grades and they're straight A students. But we hear of families who, even though their children are doing very well academically, they may be struggling mentally, maybe struggling emotionally. So really, you have to check in with your children when you see changes in behavior. Ask open-ended questions. How are their relationships at school? Do they feel safe at school? And especially if they're experiencing bullying behavior, you want to take that seriously. You don't want to just give them a pep talk and say, oh, I went through the same thing, and just be tough and push them back. No, you have to follow up on it and make sure that this isn't ongoing. And sometimes that means, as a parent, you have to step in yourself, to model for your children what that looks like, to take action against bullying behavior and to stand up against injustice. So I think that a good place to start for families is the Family Youth Institute, the FYI.org. It's a great website, has a suicide prevention toolkit for families. And I think that should be required reading for any parent. It has a lot of good tips about how to prevent suicide, not just within the larger community, but within our families too.
I think a question that a lot of people might be wanting to know the answer to is, will those who end their life by suicide be condemned to hell?
Yeah, so this is like a big thing that comes up with Muslims especially. So I think it's, when we're looking in the Quran is very direct, right, about not killing oneself. In chapter 4, verse 29, it says, do not kill yourselves or kill one another. Indeed, Allah is ever merciful. So, suicide is considered something that's impermissible, even in situations where, for example, you anticipate that you're going to be tortured or you're going to be raped, or these scenarios, you're expected to fight back, you're expected to try to protect your life. So there's never a situation where it's considered permissible. Having said that, we have to be very careful as a community not to condemn others, not to judge others just because of how they ended their life. When somebody is suicidal, oftentimes, or rather experiencing suicidal ideation, oftentimes they are not in touch with reality. They might be having a psychotic episode. They may be hearing voices. They may be seeing things that aren't there. They may, again, be so severe into their illness that they can't see reality anymore. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only knows at the cellular level what that person was experiencing before they took their life. When a person is not connected with themselves, with their own minds, it's very difficult for them to be connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we have to be aware of that and not condemn others. And, only Allah will know on the Day of Judgment how to look at those individuals. But the key is, instead of, condemning, to be proactive, to not wait until somebody ends their life by suicide. Don't wait for that to happen and then start having programming on mental health and all of that. Like, be proactive as a community and, have trainings within the masajid. In the United States, we have QPR, safe talk trainings, assist trainings. Be proactive and intervene and prevent it from happening before we get to it actually manifesting in the community.
If someone is watching this show right now and is thinking about attempting suicide, what would you say to them?
I would say to that person that suicide does not end the pain. It just transfers the pain from yourself to the people that you leave behind. And I think if you're looking for a sign that somebody cares, please take this moment as that sign. The whole reason I'm here and I'm speaking about this is because I care about you. I don't know who you are, but I know that the fact that you exist means you have intrinsic value. You were created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with a purpose, and your existence truly matters. People, when they're suicidal, one of the things that keeps them from ending their lives is, knowing that this is something that Allah doesn't want us to do. This is one of the biggest protective factors. Sometimes people lose hope that Allah is going to forgive them. They lose hope that they have even, any chance of success in their akhirah. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, says it beautifully in chapter 39, verse 53, that, all my servants who have transgressed against themselves, do not despair of the mercy of Allah. Indeed, Allah forgives all sins. It's He who is the most forgiving, the most merciful. So this loss of hope, this is one of the biggest issues. It's one of the greatest sins after shirk, losing a hope in God. Maybe the past 10 years have been really terrible. But again, it only takes one day, 1 week, 1 month, 1 year for things to turn around. It only takes meeting one right person or taking one opportunity in the right direction for things to get better. And I sincerely pray that, Allah helps you find healing in your life and gives you that will and that motivation to keep going, inshallah.
Inshallah. And thank you, Sister Anisa, for discussing such a sensitive topic and such a needed topic on this channel. So thank you so much for all your insight, for all your advice, for all your words. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And dear viewers, thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you same time next week, inshallah. Take care. Assalamu.